Sleep last night? I think we ought to do it again tonight. Yeah, all week. I'm with you, Mike. That'd be a great idea. So a couple weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer than that now, my parents picked me up at the airport in Kansas City. I'd gone there for a preaching conference at our seminary, and I was going to be staying with them, and they picked me up. It was a Sunday evening. We drove down. The airport in Kansas City is actually a northern part of the city, and they live about 20 miles south of South Kansas City. And so we made our way down I-49 and out the Peculiar exit. That really is the name of the town they live in, Peculiar, where the odds are with you. That's right. That's what yeah. So we go through the one stoplight in their town to the driveway. We go up the hill and take a left to their house. And we're pulling into the garage. As the garage door is being raised, I automatically look to the left of where we're going because that's where my dad's truck always sits. And I was going to be allowed to, that was going to be my transportation for the week. Only I look over there and the truck is gone. And in its place is this little car that could fit. It's sort of like that. His truck wasn't a step side, but it was, that's black, four-wheel drive, Chevy Silverado, man's truck. And I look over there next door, and what I see is, by the way, this is a life-size picture of, not a scale model, that is the size right there, a Chevy Spark that he affectionately called Sparky. Now, I know he's excited about that change, but I'm not happy about it at all. And I look at that car, and he's smiling, he's happy, and I'm happy for my dad. But the first thing I thought was, where can I park this thing at the seminary where nobody will see me getting out of it? And for those moments, I could sense this, I thought I was like a holy person, sanctified, saved, all that. But I realized that every ounce of sinful pride that still existed and resided in the deep places of my soul all came rising up to the top with a fury that could not be suppressed. And it did not get any better the next day whenever I got in Sparky and got over to the on-ramp for the interstate, and I'm pushing and praying and hoping that we will get up to the speed limit before I actually get into the fray that is I-49 going north into Kansas City. So I knew I was in really bad trouble when I get into South Kansas City and a car goes whizzing by me that I thought, now that is a cool car. It was a Ford Focus with tinted windows and a spoiler. And if you drive a Ford Focus, I'm sorry, but this is the first time in my entire life that I ever thought anything positive about a Ford Focus. So I took a picture of Sparky and I sent it to my kids, and I got back all kinds of responses like, where's the truck? And the boys, can I buy the truck? Is it already gone? Has Grandpa gotten rid of it? And Brooke says, what was he thinking? My sentiments exactly. Now, he thinks it's a good trade going from the truck to Sparky. It's good on gas and all that. But in my eyes, it was a bad trade. The scripture for today really has me thinking about bad trades. Any sports fans out there know that in the history of sports, there have been some pretty bad trades that have happened. Any Brett Favre fans out here? Okay, do you all know, there were some people in first service that got this. I was pretty proud of it. A little trivia question. Do you know the team that drafted Brett Favre in the NFL? Who said that? Jeff got it, the Atlanta Falcons. So he played 1 year, sort of, for the Atlanta Falcons. The coach at that time didn't care for Brett Favre. He threw 5 passes his rookie year. 3 of them were incomplete. 2 of them were completed, but to the wrong team. Favre's first year, 0 for 5 with 2 interceptions. So the coach of Atlanta saw an opportunity to get rid of Brett Favre, and he's like, I'm all over that. So he traded him to the Green Bay Packers for a first-round pick in the next draft, with which he selected a running back named Tony Smith. Anybody ever heard of Tony Smith? I've never heard of Tony Smith. He played for 3 years as their running back, fumbled 9 times in 3 seasons. The last couple years ran back kicks and then just kind of quietly went off into oblivion. Meanwhile, Brett Favre becomes the Iron Man of the NFL, starting more consecutive games than anybody in the history of the game. Wins the Super Bowl 3 in a row, MVP awards, only guy ever to do that. And you look at that and say, for the Atlanta Falcons, bad trade. For the Green Bay Packers, awesome trade. Anybody watching the World Series? Go Royals, yes. So, you know, the Royals and the Mets, it's been a long time since they've been in the series. And the Mets probably would have been in it a whole lot more often had they not been a part of one of the worst trades in Major League Baseball history. So have any of you ever heard of a guy named Jim Fregosi? He was a shortstop that the Mets wanted in the worst way. In fact, they were willing to wheel and deal a lot to get this guy. So they traded 3 other players and a very young pitcher by the name of Nolan Ryan to get Jim Fregosi, who gave them not even one complete season of productivity. Nolan Ryan went on to become the guy who threw more strikeouts than anybody, Hall of Fame pitcher. You know, the Mets probably would have visited the World Series more frequently had they kept a hold of that guy. Terrible trade. Terrible trade. Well, we're in Judges chapter 16. And in this little story, I think we find 2 of the worst trades in human history. In case you haven't been with us, we've been in a series in the book of Judges. And if you know the story of Samson, don't get too far ahead of us. If you've not heard it before, let me just give you a little bit of background. Last Sunday, Pastor Patrick preached on Judges 13. We've been seeing this kind of cycle in the people of Israel, their history, all the way through Judges that goes something like this. The people of God stop acting like the people of God. They worship other gods. They don't pay any attention. They don't serve God. They don't live a set-apart life. And so they forget about God. In response to that, God sends somebody to get their attention, usually by way of an enemy army that would give them a pretty significant beatdown and bring them literally to their knees to the point where the people of God would cry out, maybe we should ask God for some help here. So they would call out to God, ask for help. God would hear them. He would respond to their cries by sending a judge, a deliverer. And over and again, the deliverer would be raised up. They would deliver God's people by leading them in battle to defeat their enemies. For a season, they would enjoy a time of peace and obedience to God and living the way God wanted them to. And when that generation of people who had fought the battles died out, it wasn't long before they were right back over here living as something other than the people of God. That's the pattern all the way through Judges. Typically, whenever God raised up a judge about over here, it would be somebody who was already fully grown, who was ready to just step into that role. But the story of Samson is a little bit different. God came to Manoah and Mrs. Manoah, and we don't get her name in Judges 13, and says, you're going to have a son who you are to raise. From birth, he needs to be raised like with a Nazirite vow. Don't cut his hair. Don't give him any wine. Don't let him touch anything unclean. He is to be set apart to be my instrument and vessel to deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. So that's the story of Judges 13, the story of Samson's birth. By the time we get to 16, he's now an adult. He has this superhuman strength that God has given him that he is using to defeat the enemies of God's people. And that's where we pick up the story, Judges 16. We're going to read just verses 4 through 6 to start with. Let's stand in honor of the reading of the word. After this, he, that's Samson, fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. The scholars say that resulted, that amassed to about 28 pounds per person that was giving her the bribery. So Delilah said to Samson, please, tell me what makes your strength so great, and how you could be bound so that one could subdue you. This is the word of the Lord. So we're not sure how long they've been married, but we do know some things about Samson, that he's, at this point, really, he's been a whole lot better at breaking vows than he has been at keeping them. At this stage in his life, the Nazirite vow that included no alcohol, he had forgotten that part of it. That included don't touch anything unclean, he had ignored that. He had essentially been living as if he had totally forgotten about his set-apart status, except for the fact that his hair had not been cut. His hair was the source of his strength. Well, actually, God was the source of his strength, and his hair was the secret of his strength. So they've been married for probably not very long, and the rulers of the Philistines come to Delilah with a deal she cannot pass up. I imagine them bringing like all this money, all this silver with them when they come to her to entice her into agreeing with their plan and their plot, which is to find out the secret of Samson's strength. And when she sees that pile of money, I'm imagining that she was probably thinking something like, man, the wardrobe that I could get with that. And somebody's first service said, yeah, how many shoes could she get with that? How many expensive perfumes, and how many, she could afford to buy some servants whose only job would be to pamper her 24/7. And she could buy, well, literally, she could probably buy whatever in the world she wanted with that. And at that point, she made up her mind that she was willing to trade marital fidelity for a monetary reward. She was willing to trade relationship for reward. So in the next verse, what happens is she begins to coax him. Samson, so tell me, what is the secret to your strength? And with that question, as we read the story, we know what kind of woman Delilah is. She's a user. She's a person who values possessions more than people. Her character is revealed the first time she asked Samson the question. I don't know where I heard it. It's been years ago. But the story is told of a very wealthy man, like a bazillionaire, who was riding, probably would have had his own plane, but for the sake of the story, just bear with me. He was riding commercial. And so he was flying somewhere to do what rich people do. And it just so happened that in the seat next to him ended up this beautiful, very, very, very beautiful young woman that he engaged in conversation, and he found that he was having lustful thoughts about her, and he decided, hey, I'm just going to lay it out before we hit the ground. And he asked her, hey, whenever we get to this city that we're headed to, I want to take you to a hotel room. Would you go there with me for $100,000? Just once? He's like, yeah, I'll do that. He said, well, how about $50,000? And she was a little hesitant, but running the numbers in her head, that's more than I make in a year. So, yeah, I'd do that. His next question was, how about 500? And she was indignant when she responded with, what kind of a woman do you think I am? And his response was, we established that with the very first question. I'm just going to try to find out how least it can cost me. The character of Delilah was determined with the first question. Samson, tell me the secret of your strength. Because I'm going to give it away. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to use it to get what I want. And we look at that story and say, man, what was she thinking? How could she be willing to make that kind of a trade? Why would you trade a person, a marriage, a relationship? Why would you trade that for money? And I guess it's the same reason why people do it today. What do people think whenever they trade a bigger paycheck, which means they will have zero time with their family? What are they thinking? Well, what are people thinking whenever they have a wife or a husband at home that has been faithful to them, and they have an opportunity to be unfaithful, and they seize it, not because they're getting any kind of money out of it, but because they're just driven by their own desires and the flesh? What do they think? Why would you trade a healthy home life for a fling that would never last anyway? Why do people get in business with their friends and trade the friendship for the profit? I don't know why, but I do know this, that it's not just Delilah that has been willing to make a bad trade, who has been coaxed and wooed and suckered into making decisions that we wish we could go back and do over again. It's not just Delilah that has made a bad trade. So she asked Samson, tell me the secret of your strength. And really, it's pretty a crazy story. I mean, if you think about it, if you haven't read it, you can read it, but I'll tell you. Here's how it goes. Samson toys with her. He plays around and he says, okay, here's the secret of my strength. If you tie me with 7 thongs that have never been dried, then I will be just as normal as any other man. And he chuckles and he goes on. Well, sometime later, he falls asleep in the vulnerable position with his head in her lap, vulnerable, trusting. And the guy must have been a pretty sound sleeper, because while he's sleeping, she has him tied up. And he must have had a pretty good-sized house, too, because all those Philistines that said, we're going to give you some money, like I'm going to sell you out to the tune of 1,100 pieces of silver and multiples of that, They were all hiding in a room in Samson's own house. She brought them into his house and tied him up and said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, expecting that he wasn't going to be able to do anything. The guy jumps up. He shreds those things like they're nothing and starts sending the Philistines scurrying all over the place. But at this point, there's no question what she's going to do when she knows she's giving the secret away. But the word says that she continued to nag him. That's not Steve, that's Scripture. In some translations, it says coaxed. In others, it says that she nagged him until he was vexed, until he's like, man, I can't stand this. Why don't she just stop it? And then she enters into the conversation this dreaded phrase of, if you loved me. If you loved me, you would tell me. You made me look like a fool in front of these Philistines. If you really loved me, Samson, you would tell me your secret. And I'm wondering how many times that line has been used and abused. If you really love me, you'd have sex with me even though we're not married. If you really love me, you'd look the other way at work when I'm doing something I'm not supposed to do and you know it. If you really love me, you would buy me this. If you really love me, you would reward me with that. If you really love me. And I'm wondering how many times that phrase has been used to manipulate people. Can I just give you a word to the wise? That if anybody ever starts a conversation with, if you really love me, you better be careful, because chances are what they're asking you to do is going to be engaging in a trade that isn't good for you. Don't make that trade. So a couple other times, Samson toys with her. Well, if you do this, I'll be like any other man. If you do that, I'll be like any other. And he progressively gets closer to the source of his strength, the secret of his strength, when he says, all right, got these 7 braids, and if you'll just weave them into a loom, I'll be like any other man. I mean, can you imagine how sound this guy must have been able to sleep? He's sound asleep. They're weaving his hair through this stuff, and he's like out of it. I don't know if he drank like crazy. I don't know if she, but man, you could have driven a Mack truck through there and it wouldn't have woken the guy out. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He jumps up. He's as strong as any other man. And then finally, after days and days and days and weeks of nag, she won't stop. She's relentless. She's not giving up. She wants to know the answer, and she won't let up until she gets it. And finally, I'm thinking out of a desire to just get some peace and quiet, Samson says, all right, here's the story. And it's sad, and it's kind of shameful, I think, that they've been together now for quite some time. And because he's not been living like a Nazirite, she didn't know he was supposed to be one. My parents raised me. The angel came and said, Judges 13, that I was going to be a deliverer of God's people. They were instructed, don't let me drink any wine. Don't let a razor ever touch my head. Don't let me touch anything unclean. And my parents were true to that. That's the way I was brought up. And she's probably scratching her head like, well, I've seen him drink. I've seen him touch unclean things. I've said, he hasn't really lived like that. The only thing that he's maintained in all of that is the fact that his hair hasn't been cut. He says, that's the secret. That's the secret of my strength is my hair. You cut it, I'll be like any other man. So we're going to pick up the story in chapter 16, beginning with verse 15. We'll read through 21 now. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great. Finally, after she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So you can't say this to your women, but I can say it to them. Don't be nagging. You're welcome. Y'all can pay me for that one later on. Don't be nagging. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I would become weak and be like anyone else. When Delilah realized that he had touched her, that he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, this time come up, for he has told me his whole secret to me. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, And she called him in and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." When he woke from his sleep, he thought, "I'll go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. What were you thinking, Samson? Why on earth would you ever trade the secret of your strength, the source of your strength? Why would you forsake the source of your strength and give away your secret for some peace and quiet that was anything but peaceful or quiet? And I think I know part of the reason why. Because he was deceived into believing that if he just did that, this would get better. If I just tell her, the nagging will stop. If I just get a divorce, the turmoil will end. If I just find somebody else, I'll truly be happy. If I just exchange this for this, then it will be better. It will be good. It will be, and it very rarely is. Because if the deceiver is good at anything, it's deception. And getting us to believe that we should trade what is good and right and holy for something that is bad and wrong and unholy that might be an immediate fix to something that ends up causing a lot more problems down the road. If there's anybody that has made a bad trade, it's Samson. But the tragedy in the story is not just that Samson makes a bad trade and Delilah makes a bad trade. The tragedy in the story is that the people of God seem to have a hard time learning from the people of God. Tragedy in the story is that there is not one person in this sanctuary who could say, "I've never made a bad trade." The tragedy in this story is that it's your story and it's my story. The tragedy is that we have been duped maybe more than once, maybe 100 times into believing that what was promised was going to be delivered, and it never was. We have been duped into sacrificing relationship for a reward that wasn't very rewarding. We have been deceived into sacrificing the secret and the source of our own strength for something that wasn't very peaceful or quiet, either one. And this scripture is not just about something that happened a long time ago and another time in another place. It's about what's happening with us. It's about how many times have I made a bad trade? How many times have I forsaken covenant faithfulness with my God for the sake of popularity or reputation? How many times have I forsaken covenant faithfulness with my spouse in order to get something that I felt like they weren't giving me? How many times have I given up my set-apart status to live like somebody that didn't even know God? How many times have we made a bad trade? So the Philistines come, and his strength is gone, and they gouge out his eyes, and they take him down to Gaza, where in the story just before this, he had been there before. And last time Samson was at Gaza, he literally ripped the city gates off the hinges and carried them off in a display of strength. Now, as he comes back into that place with the doors still off the hinges, it's not beating his chest, the big bad Samson that is the man of God and deliverer of the people of Israel. It is being led like a blind man in chains. And they take him to a prison, and they set him up with this mill where he literally becomes like a beast of burden, and he does nothing all day long but walk in circles grinding grain while the Philistines poke fun at him. And he has lost everything. Just when it looks like the story will have nothing but the worst of endings, we get a hint of grace in verse 22. This is what it says. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. In other words, Samson had literally done everything he could do to cut himself off from the source of his strength, and yet it began to grow again. Samson had not acted like a Nazirite. Samson had not fulfilled his vows. Samson had forsaken his God, and yet the hair began to grow again. Samson had given up the source of his strength. Samson had married a woman that he should never have been with. He had gone to a place he should never be, and his hair began to grow. Samson, the scripture never says he asked for his hair to grow. It doesn't say he demanded. It doesn't say he called out to God. But in the midst of his sin, in the midst of his rebellion, in the midst of his brokenness, grace began to grow. Because that's what grace does. Now, it's a pretty cool analogy here, I think, that at least in this story, grace is hair and hair is grace. But for all you bald people, there's still hope. There's still hope, because if this story tells us anything, it tells us that when we've gotten to the point where we think we can never get up again, grace begins to grow. That when we've got a mountain of regret that we wish we could go back and do over and change the outcome and do it all differently, and it's impossible to do that, grace begins to grow. When we don't deserve it and we don't ask for it, we can't demand it, and we know we don't have it coming, grace begins to grow. And I want you to know today that the God who caused the strength of Samson, when it was completely gone, to begin to be renewed. That this same God who looked at the unfaithfulness of his servant and said, no matter what you do, I'll be faithful to you, is the same God who's with us today. It's the same God who looks at all the bad trades that we have made and says it doesn't have to be the last word. Your failure does not have to be final, because grace continues to grow. Even when we've done everything in our power to cut ourselves off from the grace of God, his grace begins to grow. I think all of us would be in agreement today that the story of the gospel is really the story of a bad trade from God's perspective. I mean, I look at the story of what Jesus did for us, and I'm like, Jesus, what were you thinking? You would forsake divine accommodations for desert temptations? You would trade a kingly crown for a crown of thorns? You would trade your precious blood for my sin? You would trade that? Bad trade for you. Great trade for us. And I think he would do that, and I think he did do it. What was he thinking? I think he was thinking something like this. The world is still full of Samsons and Delilahs who they just can't seem to get what to do with grace when they get it. I'm going to make this trade because they most certainly don't deserve it, but they most desperately need it. That's why I'm giving what I'm giving. That's why he gave what he gave. Not because we deserved it, not because we got it right, not because we earned it, not because He gave it because he knew that all of us were in a condition where our strength was completely gone. We had squandered the grace and the opportunities and the forgiveness that God had desired to give to us, and we walked away and we had done our own thing, and just when it looked like it couldn't get any worse, grace began to grow. And it's a grace that God invites all of us to live into and to grow in and to receive and to respond to, so that, the next time we have an opportunity to make a bad trade, we're not doing it. Because we've figured out how that road leads, and it doesn't go anywhere we want it to. And so we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to listen to the God who's been faithful to me, who's been kind to me, who's been just to me, who's been forgiving to me, who's been powering to me, who's been wisdom to me, who's been strength to me. That's the God I'm listening to. I got good news for you today. Even if you made a bad trade earlier today, that doesn't have to be the end of the story. Why? Because grace begins to grow. As we come to the table this morning, I want us to be really mindful of the fact. I mean mindful of it. Not just mindful, but mindful of it. That Jesus lovingly and willingly, obediently and graciously offered his body on a cross and his blood to be shed because he knew we needed it. You didn't deserve that. How can I just tell you, you didn't deserve him doing that for you? Because I didn't deserve it either. In his mercy and in his grace today, he comes to us saying, my grace is sufficient for you. Your failure doesn't have to be final. There is forgiveness for your sin, no matter what it is. So as we celebrate at the table this morning, I just want you to know that the same God who never gave up on Samson hasn't given up on you either. And that's good news. Would you bow your head with me? I don't want anybody looking around. I don't do this very often, but I feel kind of compelled to do it today. I'm wondering this morning if there aren't at least a handful of people that would say, Pastor Steve, I made a lot of bad trades in my life. Made a lot of horrible decisions. It's hurt me. It's hurt other people. I don't even know what I was thinking when I did it. But I believe today that what you said about God is true. He is a forgiving God. He is a restoring God, and I need his restoration and his grace and his forgiveness today. If that's you, would you slip your hand up? Nobody else looking at me? That's awesome. Thank you, God. Beautiful. Thank you. Amen. I think when we hear a word like this, it's also an opportunity for us to be grateful, to be thankful, to bear witness to the fact that God's been good to us when we didn't deserve his goodness. So if you'd say, I know what it is to walk with Jesus, and I'm just, you know what this story did for me? It made me not take for granted what he's done for me. It made me thankful. And I'm going to leave here this morning with even greater desire and resolve to live ways that honor and glorify him, because I know